Truthfully, few issues make me more angry or upset than the steady resistance dying churches have to funding and fueling the next generation of church leaders. So it happened again recently. I was talking to a young church leader whose church plant is literally busting at the seams. They've gone to 4 services trying to accommodate a sea of young adults. And honestly, I've seen it for myself. The current church building does not fit them. The parking situation is terrible. They are desperate for a new facility, but they can't seem to open up enough space. To make it all even more interesting, they're not even 2 years old yet. The opportunity is this. They're surrounded by dozens of existing churches that have been there for years, decades, centuries, with huge buildings, excellent parking, even acreage. And guess what? A lot of these churches have no people. And that's the challenge for this generation. New churches with people usually have almost no money and no building, and dying churches with money and buildings often have almost no people. So stated that way, the swap seems pretty obvious. Shouldn't the churches with almost no people flip the keys to their building to the churches with people? And shouldn't the rich churches share with the poor churches? What I want to ask in this video is, why isn't this happening more? And I want to share 5 likely reasons why. First reason, the dying church isn't thinking missionally. Now, look, it's easy for church leaders and members to forget the mission of the church. I mean, I get it. If you think about it, even for those of you who are part of church plants that have been around for a few years, I think once a church has existed, even for, let's say, 5 years, the methods can easily become more important than the mission. Now, if your church has been stuck or declining for years, it's almost certain that the congregation and its leaders value the methods over the mission. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is you like the way you do music, you like your style of preaching, you like the time of the services, whatever it happens to be, but the methods have become more important than the mission. Churches enter kind of a death rattle at this stage that's nearly impossible to escape without a full-fledged change in leadership. But a lot of churches don't do that change in leadership. So what is the best way to get out of that death spiral, that death rattle? Well, you could totally reinvent yourself. But the writing is on the wall for a lot of churches, and probably the best way is to simply hand the keys over to a growing church, especially a church plant like the one that I talked about at the beginning. Now, this has been done successfully hundreds of times in the US, Canada, and around the world, but it is still way too rare. So if you're a church leader sitting on a building, maybe sitting on a bank account, and you want to preserve the mission, here's what you need to do. You've got to change the methods. And if you want to kill the mission, do what you've always done, and here's what's going to happen. You're going to get ever diminishing returns. I know that's harsh, but it's also true. Second reason, the dying church values dollars over disciples. So often when faced with a few dozen people left in an oversized building and a pretty full bank account, here's what dying churches do. They start thinking about the dollars that they're going to make when they sell their building. In other words, we could sell this to a developer and maybe we could get $8 million. Well, first of all, what are you going to do with that? It's not a private company. Okay, you can't just put it in your own bank account. And developers love old churches because you've seen this all across the landscape, right? You can turn them into condos, pubs, coffee shops, restaurants with a super cool vibe. I've eaten in some of those places. And you know what? I always think, why couldn't have this still been a church? So yeah, you can't pocket the cash, but boards sometimes start thinking, well, we could give all this money to mission, right? We could support some missionaries and Bible translation or whatever. And that is awesome. But what you need to remember in this moment is the mission field has also moved home. There's somebody in your neighborhood who actually has a growing church, and there are hundreds of thousands or millions of people to reach within an hour of your church, and you're probably not going to do it. So the question every dying church has to ask is whether they value dollars over disciples. Having money to give away is awesome, but what if you started to think about, okay, we're going to invest this directly in a church that will make the next generation of disciples right here at home. For my vote, I think that's a better investment. Third factor, at play here is the dying church doesn't like the style of the next gen church. I'm going to get really granular with these last few reasons. This is because methods become more important than the mission. And what happens often in a small dying church where people are older and they've done things the same way for years, it's easy for members to deliver a strong dislike for methodologies and styles, right? Dying churches are often dying because they're very attached to the way they do things. I remember when I started at some dying churches when I was finishing up seminary, they said, well, we love the way we do church. And I'm like, look around, guys. There's 6 of us. Okay. 6 people who like it the way it is. There's tens of thousands who don't. Like, we gotta take this seriously. And sometimes, they did it. They took that challenge and they changed their ways. And I'm so grateful that church would go on to become Connexus Church. We're still part of that church today. It's amazing. But more dying churches generally just say, nah, I really like the way we do things. So when a next gen church shows up, and maybe someone from that dying church shows up and they go to the next gen church, what do they notice? They notice lights. They notice music they don't like. They notice a casual dress code. Maybe somebody's got a tattoo. Maybe they don't like the hairstyles. And they notice a totally different approach. And it's easy for the dying church members to develop a critical spirit. Now, what I try to remind myself, especially every year as I get older, is it's very easy to criticize what you don't understand. And you kind of have a choice, right? Rather than be a critic, you can say, I'm just going to criticize all these people, and the 8 of us who like it this way, we're going to go to our grave protesting. Or you can be a student. Rather than fight it, what if you decided to fund it and to fuel it? So there are some real style differences. I totally get it. But next gen churches are often anxious to get the wisdom of older generations. I've been at next gen churches who are like, we're dying for somebody over 30 here. I'd love it if somebody your age came to our church. They're crying out for mentors, for role models, for parent and grandparent figures in their life. So how about this? What if one generation started to mentor the other? What if the people in that dying church said, we can come alongside people in the growing church? And you know what I've discovered too, and I've seen this in our own church, if you cast the vision in a compelling way, there are a lot of older adults who will put up with music they don't like and styles they don't like and even dress codes they don't like if they see a next generation coming to faith. If they understand that somehow they're contributing in a way to creating a church that their kids and grandkids would love, that's cool with them. Okay, 4th reason, the lead pastor needs to work longer. Now, sometimes the resistance isn't about, we don't like the music, we don't like the style. Sometimes it's not about dollars. You know what it is? The lead pastor is sitting there going, I need to work a few more years. I can't hand it over to these guys because I need the job. And sometimes that lead pastor is well into his or her 60s or 70s. But, and I feel some compassion for that, okay? A lot of pastors in this generation opted out of Social Security. They've had a low salary. The headlines about mega church pastor owns private jet. That's not true for 99.9% of pastors, okay? They've had a low salary and maybe they need to work well into their 70s or late 60s to even be able to live after they no longer do ministry. But here's what I would say, and I've said this to those leaders, is a financial issue doesn't have to become a tenure issue. The fact that you can't afford to retire doesn't mean that you shouldn't retire. Because often if pastors are hanging on for financial reasons, the passion for their job has already diminished. In other words, yeah, I wish I could have tapped out 5 years ago, but you know what? I just can't. We got to eat, right? We got to live indoors. So that's a challenge. Now, here's a possible solution. If the dying church is sitting on cash in the bank or they're sitting on endowments, it may be very prudent for the board to make financial provision for the pastor. In other words, to say, let's do this transition to this other church and we're going to pay you a pension or a partial salary for the next 5 years. And if that means, see, that's saying this is a financial issue, not a term of office issue. And if that means getting the church into the hands of a generation that can carry it boldly into the future, that's a huge win in my books. Okay, 5th and final reason, and again, we're getting in the weeds here, but there is nothing for the lead pastor to do after the dying church closes. So maybe they can afford to retire, but I mean, maybe you look at the future and maybe you're watching this video and you're that person and you're saying, well, what am I going to do with my life, right? I've done ministry for 40 years, longer. I want to keep contributing. I don't know what to do. It feels like my life is over. Look, this is a real issue. And I think what I would say is having a mission beyond your work in pastoral ministry is critical, but it doesn't mean hanging on to your office, to your tenure longer than your shelf life. That's not what it means, right? You can probably do some things. Maybe you can coach other pastors. Maybe you can do some itinerant preaching. Maybe you can volunteer somewhere. Maybe you can be just a good neighbor, a good spouse, a good grandparent. And this is a real issue for all of us in leadership. On the other side of retirement or stepping back is fear. But I would just say, look a little bit further, because on the other side of fear is freedom. There's freedom for the lead pastor, freedom for the congregation, freedom for the next gen church. And if you embrace that and say, okay, God, I don't know what's next for me, but I'm willing to step out. It's amazing to see what God can do with that kind of obedience. And I agree, for a lot of us in leadership, the idea of just, being on endless vacation isn't very exciting. But think about how you can contribute. Like, what can I do to contribute, not just consume? And if you can answer that question, whether that's paid or unpaid, then you've got something to walk into, not just something to walk away from. So if you're a church leader and you're trying to figure all this stuff out, whether you're that existing church or the next gen church, you're not alone. Okay. The frustration is real, but so is the opportunity. And what I've got for you is a community of growth and kingdom-minded church leaders inside something I put together with my team called the Art of Leadership Academy. So inside the academy, what you're going to find is almost 2,000 leaders who are in the exact same situation you are. Some of them, a lot of them, we have a lot of next-gen leaders, a lot of church planters, but we also got some people who are trying to revitalize or transition a church. You're also going to find all of my courses, strategies, support, live coaching, and a whole lot more, but best of all, community. You can check it out by clicking the link in the description of this video, and I'd love to welcome you into the Art of Leadership Academy. As we wrap up, I want you to imagine what would happen if dying churches started looking for next-gen churches and they said, you know what, we're going to give our building to you. We're going to turn over our assets to you because you can give it new life, a new vitality. The thing that we wanted to have happen maybe didn't happen the way we wanted it to on our watch, but it's going to happen now because of what we've entrusted to you. So imagine dying pastors swallowing their pride and their fear and embracing the next generation of church leaders. Imagine church leaders with people who have little money and no building, finding an incredible future because of the generosity of dying churches with few people, but a lot of money and buildings and assets. So I'd love to know, have you encountered an experience where the dying church has actually supported the emerging church? Tell me about it in the comments, because if this finally takes off, we wouldn't need to imagine, and the church would have a much brighter future.